Hi, folks. This is Andy, the Analytical Preacher. I've been talking in the last few podcasts that even though there are these acrimonious debates among theologians and Christians and preachers around the book of Genesis, around specifically how are we to interpret the book of Genesis, how much is literal, how much is historical, are the figures real, is it mostly symbolic? As we get caught up in those debates and we stake out our side and our denomination or our particular theology puts us in one court or the other, I think it creates so much enmity, so much rancor around our beliefs there, that the critical lessons that are clear, no matter how you interpret those words, that the critical lessons are lost. And it's so important that Christians understand each of the lessons from the first 12 chapters of the book of Genesis. That is such requisite foundational knowledge for a Christian today that I think it's important. So in order to kind of clear the smoke, to clear the dust from these arguments, what I want to do, what I've been doing, is taking each of the 12 chapters and just looking at the main lessons. So we're up to chapter 4 in this podcast. We're going to look at the three main lessons that we should be taking from Genesis chapter 4, taking a break from our arguments about how we interpret it and say, regardless of interpretation, here are three main lessons from Genesis chapter 4. And let's understand those lessons before we go back to the arguments. Lesson number 1 from Genesis chapter 4. Clearly, motives matter to God. We can undertake an action and generally fool other people and often fool ourselves, but motives matter to God, not just actions. We get this because it says of Cain that he brought of the fruit of the ground. He brought of the fruit. He brought something that he had grown. Whereas it states about Abel, he offered to God the firstborn of his flock, including the best of the fat portions. Totally different motivation there. We're both going to go sacrifice to God, Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve. We're both going to go sacrifice to God. One's going to take something of the fruit of the ground. One's going to take the firstborn of his flock. In other words, I'm not going to spend anything. I'm not going to invest anything. The first thing I'm going to do with my gain, with my income, with my check, the first thing I'm going to do is make an offering to God. I'm not going to give God the leftovers. It's firstborn of the flock. And I'm always going to make sure I offer God the best of what I have. Not just something so that I had something to place on the altar. And we see that, of course, carried through in the New Testament. Paul tells us that we should decide in our own heart what we want to give. The tithe technically is not required of Christians because Paul says decide in your own heart what you want to give because God loves a cheerful giver, not one who's forced or gives under compulsion. So you and I could take the same action. If you gave from your heart the same amount I give, but I'm doing it under compulsion, Genesis chapter 4 tells us God's going to read that totally different. Another huge lesson, a second massive lesson we get from Genesis chapter 4. And this is so clear because we often think about our emotions, our feelings, can lead to negative actions. But here, God sort of flips that around and he's telling Cain, your actions, your desires are what's affecting your mental state, not the other way around. If we read the verses, starting in Genesis chapter 4, in verse 5, it says, Cain was very angry and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, and you must rule over it. And you just read that quickly, and you're like, yeah, okay, I guess God is saying you seem to be upset, but it's because you know that what you did was wrong, and Abel had better motives than you. But again, I think it's a much deeper, far more powerful lesson. Let me add in a little bit of commentary as we reread those exact same verses. Cain was very angry, and his face fell, meaning he was anxious, he was sad, he was angry. There were definitely feelings of guilt, but there were also stressful emotions. And the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? Cain, why are you experiencing this flood of emotional struggles right now? If you do well, if you will live as I'm calling you to live, if your desires are aligned with mine, will you not be accepted? Would you not be able to live without this guilt that then feeds your stress and builds your anxiety? If you live as I'm calling you to live, if your desires are aligned with mine, will you not be accepted? Will you no longer be angry? Because sin came, and the inevitable repercussions of sin came, is crouching at your door. And there are always inevitable negative consequences for sin. Its desire is for you. Its desire is to control you. It will build a cycle within you where your actions and your desires lead to sins. Those sins lead to negative emotions, which then tempt you to escape those negative emotions through soothing sins of a different type. And then that leads to more bad emotions, which leads to bad sins. Its desire is for you. Its desire is to set you into that perpetual cycle of sin and emotion, and you must rule over it. You must be aware that your actions and your desires can cause this negative mental emotional state. And you must make sure that your actions and your desires are not in conflict with God's will. And again, we so often take it the opposite way. Well, he did that because he was angry, acted that way because she was rejected. And we rarely think, again, we often think that our emotions, our anxieties, our stresses can lead to negative desires, can lead to negative actions, which then have negative consequences. But God, again, is reversing that here. He's saying your actions, your desires are what's initially causing your mental health struggles. And now your mental health struggles, your anger, is causing you to sin even more. Your anxieties are causing you to look for sinful ways to soothe those anxieties. And sin's desire is to get you in that cycle. But you have to first point the finger at yourself and say, it is not my stresses that's causing my sinful actions. It started with my sinful actions, and it started with the guilt of being outside of God. And then the third powerful lesson we see from Genesis chapter 4 is that we just have to put our human accomplishments in the proper place. God tells us to work hard. God said, subdue the earth and have dominion over it, which we kind of read as build scientific knowledge, build technological knowledge, understand nature, and figure out a way that you can work through, even sometimes now in a cursed world, work around nature. We're told to work hard, to work smart. But we're also told that God is first. And it's so easy for us to get impressed with our own brilliance, with our own accomplishments. And we see in Genesis chapter 4, Cain's offspring is noted there for some just incredible achievements. It says among things, they built cities, they began to herd livestock, they created musical instruments, and they began playing and writing for those musical instruments. They were involved in metallurgical science. They were forging items of bronze and iron. Think about how early in human history we're talking about. And we have to be impressed with what they were accomplishing. Cain's people were brilliant and accomplished. And yet we see in verses like chapter 4, verse 23, this selfish violence that was produced by those same people, this earthly focus that was held by those same people. But of Seth and his immediate descendants, Genesis 4 says that they began to call on the name of the Lord. And so it is so easy to admire and to work to want to be wealthy and successful ourselves, or to emulate or to hold up with respect those who have had earthly success. And yet ultimately, Genesis 4 reminds us that the only thing that matters is if we call on and how we call on the name of the Lord. Yes, work hard. Yes, work smart. Keep it in its proper perspective. Don't define yourself. Don't allow your history or your family's history to be defined by your worldly accomplishments, but always by your gospel commission. Because ultimately, here's what we see. In the following chapters, Cain's people and all of their worldly accomplishments and possessions were washed away in the flood. And Seth's descendants, who began to call on the name of the Lord, are saved by God through the ark. So work hard, work smart. And I've got no problem saying I respect the way that person did this. I really look up to that scientist because they were able to discover that. But everything's within the framework of God created it. God owns it. It's all for God's glory. And I will do my part to proclaim and reflect that glory regardless of what is going on in the earth around me. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this is Andy.